Many ways were tried. They would put panels on the ground. The pilot would look at the panel to figure out what was trying to be said, and he would wave or somehow communicate back to the troops. Eventually, they did put a radio telegraph into an aircraft to help them control artillery. But when you come right down to it, a wireless was really the only thing they could do, but it had to be better than what they had. And so the RFC, they were smart, Royal Flying Corps, which is a predecessor of the RAF. The Royal Flying Corps drafted Marconi's best engineers and put them to work. And one of the fellows they drafted was Major Charles Edmund Prince. Prince was one of the leading electrical engineers of the day. He has many patents to his name before the war, and he was very, very imaginative in his design and his understanding of electricity and electronics and the potential of the vacuum tube. And he saw that they really needed speech. If you're flying a plane, you really can't be keying to Morse to communicate. And you have to be trained in Morse as well as trained to fly the plane, as well as trained to shoot a machine gun. And even if you could send Morse, you were kind of busy in those days flying the plane and trying to fend off enemy aircraft. But if you could talk, that's a different story. So he understood that speech communicated by wireless was the right answer. But it also needed to be simple. It had to, the guy is not going to sit there and twiddle knobs and do the careful calibration necessary to communicate. He wants to push to talk. He wants to push a button and then he talks. And it has to be operated by unskilled personnel. He also recognized that this is a very harsh environment, high vibration, very a real design challenge. He recognized all these things, and despite the obstacles, he built one. He built a vacuum tube transmitter and receiver in 1915, in the summer of 1915. He built it, put it in an aircraft. It was light enough because it was a continuous wave as opposed to a spark system, so it didn't need heavy batteries. It was much more efficient. And he built a transmitter that enabled them to communicate with an aircraft when he first did it, 50 miles away, then 100, then 150. He even demonstrated it to Lord Kitchener, who was the head of the British Armed Forces, and showed him it could be done. So, aha, here's the answer. But I know it wasn't used. Why? Well, that's what the book is all about. Trying to determine why it wasn't used. The fact of the matter is that it was a lost opportunity. He had built this system that he could use with an aircraft. And of course, if it could be used in an aircraft, it could have been used on the ground. It could have been carried forward by people saying, don't send the second wave in. Or it could have been carried by the artillery observer saying, look, you've got to take out this machine gun nest and here are the coordinates. It could have been used, but it wasn't. The only thing that was used by the British in the First War were Marconi spark radio telegraphs. Only at the very end of the war did they use continuous wave radio telegraphs. At the very end of the war. And they were telegraph sets still. They required training in Morse to operate. They didn't use what we know as radios in the war. And it's a great tragedy. Because the consequences of not using radios meant that the British Army had lost a major way of being flexible in the field and conducting operations in the field. And when they were planning an assault on the German lines or some other military operation, they would have had more flexibility rather than build the assault around the fixed telephone system or whatever fixed communications they had, which they had to do. But even more important, that chart I showed at the beginning of the talk, the casualties would have been far less. And it could have been, if not a war winner, certainly a war shortener. And that alone would have made a big difference. So it is a real tragedy. We have a lot of opinions as to why this didn't occur, but the blame really resides with the British Signals Organization that didn't take advantage of what they should have known. It was well known even then that communications were a problem, and they should have seized upon any opportunity to improve them, and they did not. So that's pretty much what the book is all about, what this talk is all about. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer questions. Sure.
Dr. Lyons, were the Germans behind, the same as, or ahead of the British?
Well behind. Well behind. In fact, when a British aircraft came down behind German lines late in 1918, toward the end of the war, a German officer who was smart enough to realize what the British had, they had a CW transmitter on the aircraft, radio telegraph, but it had a CW transmitter. Immediately let his superiors know, look what the British have done. If they keep this up, we're going to lose this war. Of course, they'd already lost it. But no, they were nowhere near where the British were. The British had the leading telecommunications industry in the world at that time. It was a national resource that wasn't, but should have been exploited, and they didn't do it. The Germans, they're smart guys, and they did a lot of clever things, but exploiting radio was not one of them. Any other question? I do have copies of my book.
Signed?
To sign, yeah. But there's, I need to mention this. We found when you publish a book, you have no control over the price that the publisher puts on it. And we were really astounded to learn that he listed the book at $45 a copy. And it's what I would call a quality paperback, but it's still a very expensive book. We get a discount, and I'd be glad to sell it to you all for $35. And of course, I'll sign it and be happy to do it if you're interested. But I'm not here to sell books. I'm just here to tell you about radio in World War I and share with you the tragedy of what happened. My colleague and I are going to be talking to a group of British historians who specialize in World War I in England in October. And we think we'll raise some eyebrows and perhaps get some very interesting comments from them.
Where's this meeting going to be? Is it going to be here or in England?
Pardon me?
The meeting you're going to have with your friend?
Where is the meeting? The meeting is going to be held at the Center for First War Studies, which is a specialized graduate school at the University of Birmingham in England.
All right, okay.
Yeah, there are two places in England that have World War I scholars, a collection of World War I scholars. That's one, and the University of London is the other. My colleague got his degree from Birmingham.
You subscribe to that book company over in England that has all the military books?
No, it's not Playboy.
I forget the name. I get it every month.
Maybe? Or are you thinking about
Yeah, they specialize only in military publications.
Yeah, that's Osprey. O-S-P-R-E-Y.
Yeah,
Well, our publisher is, we found a publisher in the United States, McFarland, who does do World War I books, and when we approached them, they indicated great interest in it.
Yeah, they're very heavy in World War I.
Oh,
All the
absolutely.
list of the dead, from each regiment.
Oh, yeah.
Everything right up to the present time.
If you go into a bookstore in England, like we have shelves that are full of Civil War, they have shelves for...
Oh, just tons of them, yeah. But you get some good books from them, though. You get some very good books. That's great. You know how Major Armstrong died?
Yes, I do. He committed suicide.
It's a sad story.
Didn't he and Lee DeForest have litigation all through there?
Yeah,
30 years they fought, yeah. And the wrong guy won. DeForest won, but Armstrong was the person who should have won, but he did not. But that's not why he committed suicide. He committed suicide, but he also invented FM.
Yeah.
You know how he committed suicide?
Yes, he jumped off a building.
Well, no, it's more than that. He was in his apartment in New York, talking to his friends and his wife. He put on his coat, his hat, his glasses, and he was in a tall New York apartment, walked out the window and down.
Yeah.
He just walked out of his apartment and down the window. He also drove a nice setup, a Cine car. little trivia.
It was a real tragedy, but he,
Well, and that, I can tell you another.
it's a long story. There's a great book called Empire of the Air that Tom Lewis wrote that tells about Armstrong in the forest and David Sorenhoff. Any other questions?
There, another.
Oh, yes.
Is the interest in World War I in England similar to the interest in the Civil War in America because it was primarily an infantry war?
No, I
As
don't
opposed
think
to
so.
World War II?
My guess, no, my guess is that it's because it's a national, we lost 700,000 men in the Civil War, almost double what we lost in World War II. And the country was not very populous. It might have had 30 or 40 million people. That's total, north and south. And Britain lost comparable level of casualties in the First War, because Britain at that time was only about 20 or 30 million people. So you can imagine the traumatic effect. You can't go to any English town without seeing an obelisk or some sort of a memorial. And the cemeteries on the Western Front in France are just, they go on and on and on and on. I mean, and people can visit cemeteries from England. They just go across the channel and they can see the Western Front. And just like we can see our Civil War battlefields.
They still carry on what they call in Great Britain. You might know about that too. The myth of the lost generation.
Oh, yes. Well, they did lose a generation.
No,
it's not a myth. They did lose a generation.
Yeah, they do. But they talk about in relation to loss of energy, industry, education, not much as in casualties, but in loss of the advancement of Great Britain.
Exactly.
They lost that
See, there's one thing
educated generation.
Well, that's.
You know, it might have been that the decision-making elite in the British Armed Forces didn't have the wherewithal to deal with this technology.
That's
Well,
true.
I don't think the
They were
technology-
still using horses, maybe in the First World War,
Well-
which was true.
They didn't understand technology.
No.
That's true, but that's not the reason. The reason is, my personal opinion is that they should have known better. They should have recognized during the war that communications were a major problem, and they should have bent every effort. They did it with the tank. They were losing so many people that Churchill said, well, why don't you put people in a steel box? And they went from the prototype to an operational tank in 6 months. This is in World War I, 1916. It could have been done with radio. If they recognized their problem and recognized put kind of a moon landing type effort behind it, but they didn't. And for that, they can be faulted.
Well, another thing that was faulted a little bit, that they didn't recognize, if I'm correct me on this, that they didn't recognize the value of the machine gun as the German did. And they were rather anti-machine gun.
At the beginning of the war, but they learned.
Yeah, at the beginning, yeah, and then that Lewis gun was particularly.
Well, the Lewis gun was an excellent weapon, but it's a light machine gun. The German machine gun that you saw in the film
Yeah.
clip, I've seen one, and they're about this tall. They weigh about 300 pounds. They had to disassemble it in order to move it, but it was capable of 600 rounds a minute. Invented by Maxim, Hiram Maxim. So, but the generals never understood what a huge difference that made. So.
Oh, we had things in our country we didn't like in World War II that weren't quite right either. That's another story, another generation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.